Hello, I am Dr. Décio Yandoli Jr., and on behalf of the International Medical Spiritists Association, I welcome everyone and thank you for being here with us in this first visual congress of the International Medical Spiritists Association. I am delighted to introduce you to our first speaker of this event, Dr. Vicente Pessoa. Dr. Pessoa is an infectious disease physician at the Instituto de Infectologia, Emílio Ribas in São Paulo, with a master's degree in epidemiology from the Institute of Tropical Pathology and Public Health at the Federal University of Goiás, and the current vice president of the Spiritist Medical Association of Goiânia. Dr. Pessoa is here to talk about the topic of pandemics through history and COVID-19 and repercussions on the evolution of human beings. Dr. Vicente, welcome to our first Congress, and the word is yours.
Hello, friends. It's a great honor and a great joy to be here in this virtual Congress of the International Medical Spiritists Association. I am grateful for an invitation of this association through dear Dr. Sonia Dai and my dear friend Dr. Décio Yandoli Jr., who made so kind and so warm an invitation. Dr. Yandoli is a person for whom I have a great esteem and a great respect. I thank God, too, for the chance to be here talking a little about this very important subject in our current moment, which are the pandemics. We'll see in my slides that I'd like to share with you now that my topic is the role of pandemics in the history of humanity and their repercussions in the evolution of human beings and the impact of COVID-19 in the present and in the future. So starting from this premise, from this title, I would like to visit some aspects that I think are important for us to analyze during a pandemic, or otherwise some aspects that are, we think, important for humanity in general. Among these aspects, we can say that pandemics are capable of triggering fear and anxiety, which are their characteristics. Perhaps no other occurrence in history can arouse as much fear, as much anguish, as much uncertainty in people and population in general as pandemics. They bring with them a historical aspect related to high mortality rates. So when humanity is faced with a pandemic, sometimes millions of people have their lives taken, and this ends up having an economic repercussion, a social repercussion, and a scientific one when it comes to humanity. They also bring with them, behind all that tragedy, behind all that situation of pain, they bring great scientific achievements, especially in public health for humanity. So it was through the great pandemics of history that humanity has reached to the point where we find ourselves today. Perhaps if we had not had so many epidemics and pandemics throughout history, we would not have made so much progress in terms of achievements when it comes to welfare and public health. And another important aspect to be discussed is that they are far from being over. Very likely, the pandemic we're experiencing will not be the last one we will face. In fact, human beings end up making room for new viruses and new bacteria to come into their system in a moment. It was like that in all epidemics of humanity. We open niche spaces for that specific microorganism could act, triggering an epidemic or a pandemic. For example, in the time of the Black Plague, the terrible public health conditions, the ignorance of the microbiological theory of diseases, the ignorance of the theories of hygiene and cleaning and water treatment were fundamental for the installing of the Black Plague, as well as cholera, smallpox, and etc. And at the present time, our own lifestyle favors the spread of various respiratory viruses,
pandemics related to lung infections caused by virus. We live in a globalized world where distances are reduced, shortened. We are able to reach the other side of the world almost instantly in a few hours. We live in urban agglomerations. We live in a very urban society where people are always very close, in very intimate contact, very regular contact. And this ends up favoring the transmission of respiratory viruses. So as we can see, the history of humanity ends up being written on the pillars of pandemics. They were responsible for important political decisions, economic decisions, important social decisions. They've influenced art, literature, architecture, society as a whole. And that is why this historical review that we'll do in the first part of our presentation on the main pandemics and their consequences and their achievements for humanity were based on work published by the Yale University Press, a book in 2020 called Epidemics and Society, organized by Professor Frank Snowden of Yale University. They use this material in a training course for students in that university. But the discussion went so much deeper that they've decided to release this material as a book now in 2020. And in this book, they review not only the clinical aspects of these diseases that have affected humanity, but also their impact on society, their social, economic, technological, and scientific impact. And therefore, from now on, our reference to discuss this theme will be precisely this book, this work, which we recommend to all our listeners. In the past, diseases brought great ignorance along with them. We did not know, for instance, that infectious diseases were infectious. It was not known that these diseases were transmitted from one person to another. After all, we didn't even know about the existence of microorganisms, and therefore it was impossible to deduce that these microorganisms were the causal agents and that they passed from one person to another, causing the disease. There was, in fact, a mystical vision of all diseases, including infectious diseases and epidemics. This mystical vision traveled from the superstitious to the marvelous, and it brought with it the idea of the divine origin or the diabolic origin of diseases. So, the disease could be considered, for example, as a divine punishment to punish a certain society or a group of people who perhaps had questionable or doubtful behavior according to the moral norm that should have been followed at that time. It's also well known within history that the church has had a great role in people's lives. It dictated the rules of conduct that a given society should follow. So it was expected that people who did not follow those norms imposed by the church, the highest representatives of God on earth, it was as if these people were disobeying divine determinations. And within this view of a punitive God, these people ended up being punished, and even society and communities ended up being punished for having within themselves members who were not living in accordance with the moral views of the time. On the other hand, there was also a diabolical view of infectious or contagious diseases. And in this view, although it may be very similar to the divine origin perspective, it differs from that one in the following way. People who were affected were people who ended up not having the wrong behavior, and the people who actually had the right behavior. Those who acquired the illness were the ones who had the proper behavior. Because the people who had the wrong behavior, they had already lost their soul, their conscience, to the demons. And these demons ended up protecting them and causing diseases in their adversaries or their enemies. We will find many representations of this type of view in the culture of the times. So in this painting from 1869, for instance, from Jules-Éliane Delaunay, a French painter, called The Plague in Rome, we'll see that an angel of the Lord knocks on the door of a certain house of a person of questionable behavior who lived there. And this angel brings another representative of the Lord, which will be the disease. And that representative tries to invade the house and cause illness in the person who had the life and who was disconnected from the spiritual reality of the time, from the perspective of the precepts of the church that dominated the lives of the people at the time. And that was very important at the time. People were very afraid of being excommunicated, of being expelled from social life. And it had a huge impact on people's lives. So this painting portrays this divine origin of diseases. On the other hand, the diabolical origins have long been represented by what Americans call witchcraft, which could be a witch hunt as well. The people who sold their souls to the devil and were protected were actually people who had behavior that today we can compare to the mediums of the time. They were the people who made predictions, the people who had an extra sensitive awareness, and these people ended up being considered diabolical representatives on earth. And they were then judged for that and had their lives taken through many different trials, many different courts throughout history. And when these people ended up being hurt and condemned, and pandemics or epidemics were taking place in a specific place, blame fell upon them. And so this true hunt for these people and murdering, hunting, and killing of hundreds and thousands of people. So this diabolic origin and divine origin of diseases persisted for many years in people's reasoning and thinking. A great doctor of antiquity, Hippocrates of Kos, elaborated a theory about the diseases in which diseases would be due to an imbalance between four humors that constituted human beings. They were hot humors and cold humors. And hot humors were fire and earth, and cold humors were air and water. But Hippocrates highly valued the history of signs and symptoms, and he interviewed people trying to describe what they felt and the signs they showed on a more detailed physical examination. So he concluded that a certain humor was in excess or in a reduced amount in that person. And that characterized an imbalance. These ideas from Hippocrates prevailed for many, many years in this historical review, including Galen taking these ideas into the Roman Empire and spreading them have affected humanity without referring to the Black Plague. They were true facts. These ideas will only fall much later when we'll talk a little bit more about one of the greatest pandemics of humanity, which was the Black Plague, which had a significant contribution to the understanding of the origin of diseases. There are reports of cases well before that, but the great Black Plague pandemics then took place for more than 500 years between the year 1300 and the year 1800. Unfortunately for humanity at the time, or not, this pandemic coincided with years of many difficulties in the field of productions, of many years of bad weather, very harsh winters, that ended up taking the population through a very severe hunger, to a state of malnutrition, to a state of conflict, because of the food struggles, and even by very high taxes levied by legislators at the time. This ended up contributing to the despair of people associated with the presence of the plague, that when it entered the city, it ended up decimating most of the population. There is a report, for example, of a plague epidemic that ravaged the Italian city of Naples, which had more than 160,000 inhabitants at the time, and the city ended up with just over 2,000 inhabitants along the few years of the plague. So it was a highly virulent and highly lethal disease. More than 50% of the people affected by the plague would die. And this high virulence, and what does high virulence mean? It's the ability of a microorganism to cause disease. Sometimes we get infected by a microorganism, but it causes mild illness or practically no illness. But the plague had a high virulence, a high capacity to make individuals sick. And individuals who fell ill often died because it also had a high lethality. Furthermore, their symptoms were very excruciating. They were degrading symptoms. People felt very intense pains in the affected regions because the plague, in its bubonic form, one of its clinical forms, caused noticeable ganglia, lumps, nodules that were called bubbles, and therefore the name bubonic. Located mainly in the cervical, axillary, and inguinal regions. These bubbles undergo necrosis and exhale a very characteristic and very unpleasant odor, so that socially it was very difficult to be a bearer of plague, because in addition to the almost certain death at the time, as the origin of the disease was not really known and neither were treatments available, the unpleasant smell forced people to be isolated in their rooms to avoid social life. This all maximized the violence that brought along with the collective hysteria and fear. People under this intense fear ended up becoming very violent, trying to meet their own needs and ending up passing it over others. The plague had a very big economic impact because it affected many adults, young people in their productive ages. So many people in this age group died during these pandemics, overwhelming the economy because they were economically active with a high capacity for work. It had a very big social impact precisely because of this high mortality, because that meant that there was a very intense population control at the time. So this social control comes from the number of people who ended up dying, controlling the overpopulation or the development of population in certain regions. It also had an enormous religious impact because people started to question themselves. Why was God punishing that society with such terrible diseases? What about children who were innocent? What about people who had a correct life? And the people who were working and were supporting society? Why were they being punished by this disease? Then we see an arising of a questioning of the orders of the Catholic Church that until then, as we said, guided people's lives, and it was one of the impulses for the questioning of these orders and the appearance of reforms that we see in the future. Reforms within the norms of the Catholic Church, with the emergency of Protestantism, for example, for revisions of those norms. So look at the impact that the plague already brings us with this teaching. The reform of the Catholic Church and the rise of Protestant religions had their momentum in part, obviously because there were other factors, because of the plague, with the questioning of divine wisdom and justice. Even though people did not know the origin of the plague or how it was caused, today we know that it's caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which was discovered almost in the 20th century by a disciple of Louis Pasteur, a Frenchman. This Pasteur disciple was called Alexander Yersin, and then he called this bacterium by Yersinia pestis in 1894. But we know that this bacterium is in the flea of rats. So when rats arrived in cities at the time, people started to be afraid. There were, at the time, deaths of rats before humans. And when the rats started to die, then people knew that the plague was coming. But the idea of disease at the time was so limited that people thought that the rat died first because inhaled odors of decaying matter that emerged from the ground. It was bad air, the miasmas that even gave name malaria its name. Bad airs, malaria. The toxic miasmas that came from degrading dirt, organic waste. And because rats are shorter than humans, they inhaled these odors first, and then they died before humans. And that's how they thought. That was the idea that people had. And it was very common for these epidemics to arise from the sea. The ships docked at the ports, brought rats with them, and these rats entered the city bringing plague with them. So there was great despair. There was a collective hysteria because it was known that the city was doomed to die. Its population was doomed to die. It was Girolamo Francastoro and Athanasius Kircher, who were the two doctors at the time in the Middle Ages, who suspected that disease passed by contagion from person to person too. The pulmonary form. The bubonic form is through the flea bite, but the pulmonary form had no explanation because it happened, for example, in places like Greenland, northern Norway, Iceland, very cold places where the flea did not survive. So it was concluded that the pulmonary form could be transmitted from person to person through oral droplets, liquid droplets via the respiratory tract. And this later was confirmed by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, a German who, like Pasteur, had a prominent importance in the field of microbiology. So here we have two images of the clinical forms of the plague. The bubonic plague that affects the ganglia with the buboes, and the pulmonary form that is a disease so serious that even today with the creation of antibiotics, it's a highly lethal disease, and that at that time then it had a very high mortality rate due to total ignorance. And as we said in the beginning, diseases find a niche that has been prepared for them by humans. Humans open a certain niche, and the plague uses its niche, and which was dirt. The rat epidemic, the lack of hygiene, the sparse control of garbage, of waste, that is extremely favorable environments for rats, and the pandemic ended up establishing itself very easily and very logically with the knowledge we have today. The plague also brought the idea of the plague doctor. So people were hired to care for those people who were sick. And there were these clothes that are the beginnings of personal protective equipment. They were made of leather for the most part, because it was believed that those miasmas, the bad air, could not pass through the leather. And inside this elongated nose, doctors put various herbs, various substances with pleasant odors, and even tobacco, so that the odors, the bad airs of disease, did not invade their nostrils, ended up infecting them. And they used a stick just to remove clothes, to open shirts and see if people had the buboes and if they were infected, or even to see if they were alive when they found them lying on the floor. All that to avoid physical contact. So throughout history, we'll see that the plague brought this idea of personal protective equipment. It brought the idea that infectious or contagious diseases were in fact transmissible from person to person. So see, we are already advancing some of the ideas that the plague brought to the benefit of humanity. Doctors entered the houses and applied treatments that were absolutely empirical and ineffective, such as bleeding, and the person who was already dehydrated, with fever, malnourished, weakened, ended up being weakened even more and losing life with these different and ineffective treatments at the time. But that's what was known in order to drain these Hippocratic humors, to drain the hot humors, for example, the blood that represented fire. So people believe that. And today, it's very easy for us to criticize it with the knowledge we have. But at that time, it was a very true reality. So without criticism, these are just historical observations. It was also at that time that cities introduced some measures of control for this type of disease. For example, it was at this time of the plague that health committees were created, which today are health secretariats, the Ministry of Health, the group of people responsible for making decisions regarding the health of the community. So this idea of a health ministry, of a health department arises in that time. The isolation of cities also started at a time when cities were fenced. They were classified as pestilent. And then these cities were fenced and nobody entered and nobody left so that diseases would not spread around and to other cities. So this idea of isolation that comes from the notion that it could be transmitted from one person to another comes from that time, and even with the use of military force to ensure this isolation so that the quarantines could not be trespassed at the risk of people even being killed when they disrupted these isolations. And it happened often. People try to break through that block and lost their lives. It is at this time, too, that the idea of lazaretos that we portrayed in this image. Lazaretos were places that could be a ship, an island, or even a construction by the seashore, where people arriving by sea were isolated and kept in quarantine, as the name says, for 40 days. And why 40 days? Well, the explanation is not very well known. But the truth is that everything in the Bible was related to 40 days. So Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. Jesus stayed 40 days with the apostles after the resurrection. Anyway, everything in the Bible turns around 40 days. So as religion had an impact, an important impact at the time, it was believed that people had to spend 40 days in these lazaretos, which brings us the idea of quarantine that we use until today. When people come back from the moon, she stays 40 days in isolation with fear of having brought an extraterrestrial bacterium to Earth. And today we use that expression, even though the period is no longer 40 days for certain diseases, because we already know about their incubation periods, their clinical forms, their ways of transmission. And beyond, we have already said, the plague had a great influence on art, architecture. Several books, several poems were written about it. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet portrays the plague. Alexander Dumas portrays the plague. So, plagues had a very important impact. It also had an impact on the questioning of the Hippocratic theory of disease, the four elements, because people started to question themselves. How can Hippocrates justify and explain so many people at the same time having the same time of imbalance of the four moods? How is that possible? Where does that come from? This idea doesn't make sense to people anymore, so this started to be questioned. And then, with the advent of French medicine, the French hospital movement, Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and others will show that diseases were caused by the presence of infectious and contagious microorganisms, and that this then revolutionizes the history of infectious and contagious diseases. Another disease that had a very important impact on humanity as well was smallpox. Smallpox is also a high mortality rate. Its clinical forms can kill between 12 and 70% of people, depending on the clinical form. In this image, we see two boys, one who had been vaccinated against smallpox and another who had not been vaccinated, and then presents the characteristic lesions of smallpox. By looking at this figure, we can understand Dr. Peter Medawar's statement when he says that the virus is a piece of nucleic acid surrounded by bad news on all sides. It is an extremely deforming disease with the appearance of several ulcers along the body, including oral ulcers preventing the person from swallowing, from drinking fluids. So people dehydrated in a very intense way, and they had a very intense social scolding because of these injuries. They ended up leaving sequels, marks on the skin. Then the person was marked as having been a survivor or carrier of smallpox. It's a highly contagious disease, and people spent several days without symptoms and already transmitting the disease. So this favored the spreading of the epidemics and pandemics, increasing the spread of disease. In Europe, this disease was not an external invader, so to speak. It was a disease that already existed in Europe, and therefore it did not cause the hysteria and anguish that the plague caused when arriving in a new city, that before the arrival it was free of disease. Smallpox had existed and coexisted throughout history in several cities at the same time. But it was Christopher Columbus who took this disease to the Americas, his fleet. And then, yes, the disease was an external invader, and then it caused panic and hysteria. It decimated the population of the island where Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, and the population dropped from 1 million inhabitants to approximately 15,000 inhabitants in a very short time due to smallpox. And look at how infectious diseases will shape history. In the face of so many deaths, Columbus' armed squadron, the Spanish, ended up running out of cheap labor to explore these islands. And that was when the idea came to bring black people from Africa and use them as slaves. So one of the factors that triggered the slave trade, that impacted the history of mankind so much, and that caused so much damage, comes from the smallpox decimating the population of the island where Christopher Columbus landed in the 15th century. Late 15th century. The ideas came from there. Let's bring this cheap labor from Africa. But smallpox has to us another very big importance, an extraordinary gain for humanity. At that time, it was already known that the disease could only be had once. So those who survived smallpox did not catch it a second time. But the mechanism behind it were unknown. So initially, doctors start using the practice of inoculation. And you would inoculate pustule from people with smallpox onto other people, and they would get sick, ended up getting a mild form of the disease. Why? People who had the mild form of disease were chosen so that supposedly people who got sick would get mildly sick, but that was not a guarantee. So people got sick and sometimes seriously and died, but those who survived were then free from the disease. But Dr. Edward Jenner, who was an English doctor who worked in the countryside of England, ended up realizing that there was another very similar disease, cowpox, that if you inoculate these pustules into people's body, people would acquire cowpox that was very similar to the original wild pox. But they would be immunized, protected. And that's how the experience with a boy named James Phipps starts, where he inoculates a boy's arm with his pustule from a woman who was milking the cow's udder and transmitted this cowpox to his hands. So this pustule in this woman's hand was used to remove the secretion and the inoculate the boy James Phipps received. He fell ill for a few days, had a feverish period, then a period of recovery, and then he was exposed to the original smallpox, the aggressive smallpox, and did not fall ill. So this brings us the idea of the practice of vaccination. And this phenomenon is considered the initial movement behind vaccination. And vaccinations, we all know, is one of the greatest public health achievements we have in humanity. Vaccine saves thousands and thousands and thousands of lives every year, and all comes from there. Another disease that greatly affected Europe, especially in the 19th century, in fact, before this other disease, I'd like to comment on the yellow fever epidemic that Napoleon Bonaparte faced on the islands of San Domingo in the Caribbean in 1801 to 1802. Napoleon invaded with a fleet of 75 ships. He didn't go personally, but he sent his fleet to the Caribbean to make this island an advanced outpost to invade the United States, the southern region of the United States, that has a strong French influence. see the states of New Orleans, Louisiana, and that southern part region of the United States. So Napoleon intended to invade America and conquer the United States. Now, imagine if he achieves his plans, how the world would be different today, how world sovereignty would be different. It is the same if the Europeans had managed to cross the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, then the world would still be under Arab rule. How the world would be different today. And when Napoleon invaded this region around 1802, his troops were decimated by an epidemic of yellow fever. This epidemic did not decimate, in a way, the local population, because this local population was predominantly made up of black slaves or their descendants who were already brought a certain tolerance to the disease from Africa and from their own ancestors and from their own life in the region. But the troops from Napoleon did not. They didn't have the resistance. Then Napoleon was forced to withdraw, to leave and return to Europe, having lost the battle to the insurgents of the region who did not want to be dominated by the French. So see the impact that the yellow fever epidemic may have had on the world economic order and political order. Napoleon tries to invade Russia around 1812, and then he ends up crossing a great distance with more than 500,000 men. It was so-called the Great Army, La Grande Armée, or the Great Napoleonic Army, that whenever he went, it decimated everything. After all, to support 500,000 men, they needed to explore the land along the way. So they exploited the local farmers' plantations, the homes of those farmers, their food, their infrastructure to keep the army alive, to keep the army active. To give you an idea, to cross a bridge over a famous river in Lithuania, this army took 3 days because it was so numerous. They were not only soldiers, but a whole support team, a logistic team, including women who accompany a man in this journey. And Napoleon kept entering into Asian territory towards Russia, but he did not find a Russian army that strategically retreated to Moscow, attracting Napoleon to a cold region and an inhospitable region. And on this path, in this unhealthy environment, we opened the doors to certain microorganisms. In this unhealthy environment where 500,000 men lived in a promiscuous way with no hygiene, without any care about garbage and waste and residues, we see an epidemic of dysentery. Bloody diarrhea caused by a bacteria called Shigella begins to slowly decimate the troops. When he finally clashes with Russian troops, he no longer has 500,000 men. He has half that number, 250,000, and he's already on par with Russian forces. And through the weakness, malnutrition, then he's defeated and does not achieve his intention to invade India, because that was his objective, to invade Russia, to invade India. And see again, if he had achieved it, how humanity would be different, how India would be different. And upon his return, Napoleon is wiped out not only by Shigella, but now by typhus, which is a bacterium of the genus Rickettsia that was transmitted by the lice of humans, and that ends up killing his troops even more. So that of the 500,000 men that he left France with, only 15,000 men returned to France alive. The rest were killed by infectious and contagious diseases they found along the way. The other disease I was referring to, cholera in the 19th century, had a very big impact on 19th century Europe, or even at the time of Allan Kardec, who was the codifier of Spiritism. Spiritism, which is the religion in which the International Spiritist Medical Association builds its scientific basis. We'll comment on that a little bit later. So cholera ends up affecting the whole of Europe. People become very dehydrated. It's a bacterial disease caused by a choleric vibrio that causes severe diarrhea. So people were very dehydrated, very sick, and that is reflecting the art of the times as we see in these images. Dysentery, watery diarrhea is so intense that people lie in these beds with a hole under them because there's no time to get up and go to the bathroom. And at that time, it was not known what caused cholera or how to treat it. It was not known, for example, that it was a waterborne disease transmitted by water. It was not known that there was a microorganism involved. It was not known the issues of hygiene, water treatment, basic sanitation were vital issues for the control of cholera. Nor it was known that the rehydration of those people with hypertonic solutions was essential to keep them alive, along with a treatment of antibiotics that did not even exist, as it was not even known that microorganisms existed. So cholera greatly affects humanity in the 19th century. But it was only through the work of the English doctor John Snow around 1854, when he studies the cholera epidemic in London, that he's able to show that his epidemic comes from water, from a water pump, from a water source, as we see in these figures located in the center of the city. And then he starts to map these cases along the proximity to this water pump and comes to the conclusion the disease is waterborne. And he institutes, together with the local city hall, strict measurements for the water, basic sanitation and hygiene measures, so that people stop transmitting and acquiring this disease. He ends up controlling this epidemic with these measures and brings to humanity this incredible gain and knowledge about basic sanitation, water treatment, and more. It brings us the beginnings and principles of the epidemiological method of investigating outbreaks that is used today to investigate case zero, the rate of transmission, the mode of transmission, the symptoms of a particularly new disease. See what gains then we had from the work of John Snow and the cholera epidemic. To us today, this may seem very basic, very simple, but putting yourselves in the situation of those people who lived at that time, these discoveries are great. In the present day, we owe these people the quality of life, the scientific and medical achievements they made back then, and who has helped us. Later, still in the 19th century, the microbiological theory of diseases emerged with the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in Germany, and of the surgeon Joseph Lister in Scotland, who started using an antiseptic to perform his surgeries, showing that the use of antiseptics ended up decreasing the rates of infection of surgical wounds. Surgeons that killed a lot by secondary infection stop killing or start killing less because of the substance that Dr. Lister starts to use. So he joins Pasteur and Koch in the idea that microorganisms, subclinical microscopic entities, were responsible for these diseases and infections. And then the world is divided among the defenders of diseases, the theory of diseases caused by microorganisms, and the diseases caused by miasmas or other issues. But we know that the theory of microorganisms eventually won that still is valid today. We still also had in the 20th century, already in our 20th century, and our grandparents probably experienced the great influenza and influenza pandemic that occurred in 1918, killing over 50 million people. Some publications cite up to 100 million casualties. The great professor Euripides Barçanufo, a great spiritist in Brazil, ends up dying as a victim of this pandemic in the city of Sacramento in Minas Gerais. As we know, the flu pandemic brought the idea of the danger that respiratory viruses would be for humanity. Not only this virus from the 1918 pandemic was classified as a H1N1, but that other types of influenza viruses could impact humanity in a significant way because of its ease of transmission, its high mortality rate, and the social context in which our society was structured. very urban society, very crowded society, where the virus could easily be transmitted through close contact from person to person. So then there's this alert and the need to build preventive measures for influenza viruses. And then the influenza vaccines emerged that are still used to this very day and very successful to prevent diseases caused by these viruses. And finally, we can briefly summarize all these benefits that the infectious and contagious diseases have brought to humanity. So we see an image that characterizes one of these benefits, which is the creation and evolution of personal protective equipment. But the Black Plague brought us health committees, the isolation of cities, the idea of quarantines, the use of personal protective equipment, great influence on the arts, politics, and the questioning of the hypocritical model of diseases. Smallpox brought the concept of non-recurrence and a very important concept of vaccination. And from it came the studies that improved vaccines. Cholera brings us this idea of hygiene, the importance of water treatment, the great benefit that basic sanitation would bring to humanity, and the creation of epidemiological methods of investigating diseases. And the great flu of the 20th century also brings important benefits over the need to be alert to respiratory viruses. Many other pandemics have affected humanity. We could mention the polio pandemic, the tuberculosis pandemic, the Hansen's pandemic, measles, and also HIV as well, which is still in force today. But our time's scarce, and so we chose these diseases because of their importance within history and the social and political context, although other diseases also have their importance. So through this study, we're also able to elaborate the theory of microorganisms as causing disease, managing to show the importance of asepsis and anti-asepsis in surgical procedures, and all of this ends up triggering the search for substances that could kill or destroy these microorganisms that cause these diseases, and that culminates in the creation of antibiotics that, together with vaccines and anesthesia, are perhaps the greatest health achievements of mankind and are still used with great efficiency today. And then we finally get to COVID-19, the disease caused by the coronavirus, by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is from the genus of coronavirus that is affecting humanity right now. Our generation had never faced a pandemic of this scale, and perhaps that is why we're so frightened, so restless, so insecure, and so anxious. As the plague did that time, bringing so much uncertainty, so much hysteria, so much unrest. But if we take a look back, we will see that in all times of humanity has faced pandemics, faced infectious, contagious diseases. Our generation is the one who has not yet gone through one. And that is why, for us, this is new in this existence, in this life. We already knew coronaviruses from previous episodes, as this publication shows us that other coronaviruses caused minor epidemics in 2002 and 2012. In 2002, we have SARS, and the virus was called SARS-CoV, SARS-CoV. And in 2012, we have MERS, which was another coronavirus, MERS-CoV. The difference between the current SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV and MERS-CoV are differences in their phylogenetic constitution. And this ends up causing a difference in their ability to cause diseases and in their ability to be transmitted. So see here, we point out in this image that the SARS-CoV affected 8,000 people in July of 2003, and that MERS-CoV affected 2,500 people in January 2020. And the mortality rate of these diseases, for example, SARS has a mortality rate of 9.6%, and MERS a mortality rate of 35%, which are high mortalities. 35% of the people who get it die, and SARS-CoV, 9.6%. That is to say, 10%. Now, our COVID-19, on the other hand, has less lethality, but a high contagious that quickly reaches all corners of the world. The difference is the number of cases as this transformation of SARS-CoV-2 made it become a much more infectious disease, easier to transmit. So we see that by May 2020, we had almost 5 million confirmed cases on planet Earth. It doesn't matter much with the date being May, if we're already in the second half. It doesn't matter so much. The numbers today are already much higher. What I would like to bring to us is simply the difference in the number of cases due to the difference in transmissibility, and that is why it has scared us a lot. 6% of 5 million people are many people whose lives are threatened. The difference in transmission is very well defined in several scientific articles, such as this one, for instance, which compares the types of SARS, MERS, and COVID-19 viruses. And it shows the microbiological characteristics of this new virus as favorable to its transmission. That's why we're facing this pandemic with this worldwide proportion, with this incredible number of cases. And what does Spiritism tell us about it? Spiritism is this philosophical, religious, and scientific body of knowledge that was codified by Allan Kardec in France in the 19th century. And Allan Kardec started to investigate the phenomena of the turning tables and concluded that there were intelligent phenomena, that there were intelligent entities behind those phenomena. And obviously, he started asking questions to these entities through sensitive individuals called mediums. And through the universality of the teachings of these intelligent extracorporeal entities, he built his work that has philosophical, scientific, and religious consequences. So he asked the same question to different mediums, and the answer was the same, showing that these mediums had no way of controlling the diversity of subjects so profoundly. So obviously, he concluded that it was not they who responded, and that these extracorporeal entities were the ones responding. And so he builds his work, these 5 basic books that we call basic works, where these ideas are studied, defended, and shared. And in the first one, the Spirit's book, which is a book of questions and answers to these discarnate entities, with 1,009 questions, Allan Kardec asks in question 739, for example, do the destructive calamities have a physical use despite the hardship they cause? And these spirits, these entities will say, they do. Many times they change the conditions of a region, but the good that results from them, only generations to come will experience. You see, we're now experiencing the good that came from previous pandemics. We know a lot more about infectious diseases. We have them in far less quantity because we already have the prior knowledge that we described in the previous slides today, this previous learning. So see how this question already had this foresight. In question 740, he asks, aren't these calamities equally moral trials for men by exposing him to the most distressing needs? Calamities are tests that give men an opportunity to exercise their intelligence, to show their patience and resignation before the will of God, and that offer them an opportunity to express their feelings of abnegation, of disinterest and love for others, if selfishness does not dominate them. So notice how Allan Kardec asked the spirits, and they said that these calamities, these pandemics, these natural tragedies have this function of bringing men to this moral renewal, to this renewal of feelings of solidarity, of caring for one another, and developing our intelligences, bringing great achievements. So this pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic, for example, will give us great gains in vaccine technologies and mechanical ventilation technologies, in the technology of a new protection, personal protection equipment, more effective and more lasting, will also provide intellectual development and certainly moral development through mutual assistance. It's very interesting to note that in continuation of these questions, in question 783, for example, he asks, is the improvement of humanity always a slow, progressive march? And the spirits respond, there is a regular and slow progress that results from the force of things. When people, however, do not progress as fast as they should, God subjects them from time to time to a physical and moral shakeup that transforms them. So in fact, these catastrophes and pandemics, and they are catalysts of moral development, of humanity's intellectual development that often is progressing too slowly. And it's from this perspective that we must look at this pandemic as an opportunity for an accelerated moral development, for accelerated intellectual development as well. But what is the biggest obstacle to this progress? It comes in question 785, pride and selfishness. I refer to moral progress, the obstacle to moral progress, because intellectual progress always occurs. So intellectual progress, this pandemic will certainly bring us great scientific achievements that will improve the quality of life for humanity. But moral progress, on the other hand, will be the obstacle if we have within us pride and selfishness, and we do not combat this pride and selfishness through our moral transformation. In addition to these 5 basic works, Allan Kardec dedicated himself to building a collection of publications, such as the Spiritist magazine, where he published a monthly edition. And each month he placed an edition with several subjects related to Spiritism. And the year 1865, he introduced us to Dr. Demure in the March edition of that year. He was a Spiritist doctor who discarnated and became a protector of Allan Kardec's own health so that he could complete his work. Dr. Demure himself tells us in March 1865 that he was at the service of the Spirit of Truth, and in November 1865, Dr. Demure will bring us great considerations in an article entitled Spiritism and Cholera, where he will speak about the cholera epidemic that ravaged Europe in the 19th century, and which we have already mentioned. And he will say in this article how the Spiritists should behave in the face of pandemic. First, Allan Kardec puts his own considerations, then he places a psychograph text from Dr. Demure, where Dr. Demure will emphasize the absolute need for moral transformations of Spiritists, to be more patient, more tolerant, to not harbor hurt, to solve conflicts, to be in solidarity with others, with those who are affected by the epidemic, and those who have had moral difficulties. See how current Allan Kardec's work is. That's exactly what we need today. So these are the great messages that COVID-19 brings us. As Dr. Joshua Lederberg, Nobel Prize winner for medicine in 1958, says, and the confrontation between human and microorganisms, the only defense that humans have is their intelligence. That should be applied for the collective good. We could add to this speech by Dr. Lederberg the human being's capacity for mutual collaboration if we so choose to follow this path. So we live in a moment of reflection, of using the intelligence and the potential of intellectuality that we have for the benefit of ourselves, of our society, and contribute to the transformation of the planet as a whole, taking a leap into a world where happier spirits, more charitable, more collaborative people will live. This is the great lesson that COVID-19 must bring. Because, as Allan Kardec said in the Spirit's book, the intellectual lesson, the intellectual progress will come with it, as we mentioned in several examples. So I appreciate the opportunity to participate here with you, and I am now available for comments and questions. Thank you very much, and may Jesus bless us all.